There was once a young woman who worked in a quiet restaurant near the center of a busy city. Every morning she woke up before the sun rose and took the early bus that was always half empty. She would sit by the window watching the city come alive and think about how life had taken her in a direction she never planned. She used to dream about concert halls and big lights, but now she carried trays and cleaned tables for people who barely looked at her face. Her job was not easy, but she never complained. She greeted every customer with a polite smile, no matter how tired she was. Her co-workers liked her because she never argued and always helped when someone needed a hand. She didn't talk much about herself, so most people knew very little about her life outside of work. All they knew was that she went straight home after her shift and never joined anyone for late dinners or drinks. At home, she lived in a small apartment on the top floor of an old building. The walls were thin, the windows made a little noise whenever the wind blew, and the place smelled faintly of old wood. But in one corner of her small living room stood a piano. It wasn't a fancy one. Its paint had faded, some keys were yellowed, and one pedal was broken. Yet to her, that piano was the most precious thing in the world. When she was a child, she had learned to play it from her father. He used to sit beside her and guide her fingers on the keys. Those were her happiest memories. Later, she studied music more seriously and even got into a music school. She had dreams of becoming a pianist who could play on stage in front of big audiences. But life changed suddenly when her mother fell sick. The hospital bills grew larger and larger, and she had to leave school to work. Music faded into the background, replaced by long hours of waiting tables and saving coins for medicine. Even so, she never truly stopped playing. Every night after work, no matter how exhausted she would sit at her piano and let her fingers move. Sometimes she played soft songs that reminded her of her father. Other nights she played melodies that helped her forget the loneliness she felt. She didn't play for applause or money. She played because it made her feel alive again. In the restaurant, people came and went every day. Most of them were well-dressed and wealthy. The restaurant was known for its elegance and quiet atmosphere. A pianist usually played gentle background music while the guests dined, and it gave the place a touch of class. She often listened from afar while serving food. Each note reminded her of the part of herself that she had buried. Sometimes she paused for a second near the piano, pretending to fix a glass or wipe the table just so she could listen a little longer. But she knew her place. Waitresses were not meant to be noticed. Her uniform was simple, and she moved quickly so that no guest ever had to wait too long. Some guests said thank you, others ignored her completely. A few treated her as if she were invisible. She learned to smile anyway. Her manager, a serious man who cared only about keeping things in order, often praised her for being quiet and hardworking. "You're good at your job," he told her once. "Keep it that way and you'll never have problems here." She nodded and thanked him, even though deep down she felt a little sting. Being good at your job sounded like a small reward when your real dream was far away. Her mother, who stayed at home, didn't know much about how difficult her days were. She never told her mother about the rude customers or the long hours on her feet. When she came home, she always smiled and said everything was fine. Her mother worried enough already, and she didn't want to add to it. In her free time, she cooked simple meals, read old music books, and sometimes watched videos of famous pianists online. She wondered how it would feel to play like that again, to be on stage, to feel the warmth of the lights, and to hear the quiet before applause. One night, after a long shift, she found herself alone in the restaurant's dining area. The pianist had already left, but the piano still sat there near the window. It looked beautiful under the soft yellow light. She glanced around, no one was watching. Then she slowly walked to it and touched the keys. The sound was richer than her old piano at home. She closed her eyes and played a few notes. It felt like breathing after holding her breath all day. She played only for a minute before she heard footsteps. Her manager appeared behind her and said sharply, "That's not for you. Go finish your closing duties." She quickly apologized and stepped away. After that night, she didn't dare go near the piano again, even though her heart longed to. Still, that short moment stayed in her mind for days. It reminded her that she still had something beautiful inside her that hadn't died yet. The days turned into weeks, and life went on as usual. The same faces, the same routine, the same quiet dreams she kept locked away. But one evening, something unexpected happened. A new booking appeared on the restaurant's schedule. a private dinner for an influential businessman and his guests. It was supposed to be a big night. Everyone prepared carefully. The best dishes were ordered, the tables were decorated with candles, and the manager kept walking around nervously to make sure everything was perfect. She was assigned to that private event because she was reliable. She didn't talk much and didn't make mistakes. She ironed her uniform twice to make sure it looked perfect. She even tied her hair a little tighter that evening. She wanted everything to go smoothly. When the guests arrived, they filled the room with laughter and noise. They were dressed in fine clothes and smelled of expensive perfume. Some of them were polite, others loud and arrogant. Among them was a tall man with a strong voice, the businessman himself. He spoke as if he owned not just the restaurant but the entire world around him. Everyone laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. The pianist, who usually played during such events, was supposed to arrive soon. But as the minutes passed, the manager got a call and his face changed. He hung up and muttered, "He's not coming." The pianist had fallen sick and couldn't make it. The manager looked worried. Music was an important part of the evening. Without it, the guests might complain. She overheard this while serving drinks. For a moment, her heart began to race. She knew she could help. She had played for years and she could handle background music easily. But she also knew it wasn't her place to speak. She hesitated, carrying the tray tightly in her hands. Finally, she gathered courage and said softly, "Sir, I can play if you want. I know how." The manager looked at her as if she had said something strange. "You?" he said. "You serve food, not play piano." She lowered her eyes. "I used to study music," she explained quietly. But before she could say more, one of the guests overheard them. It was the same tall businessman. He laughed loudly and said, "Oh, really? The waitress can play piano. That's something I want to see." The other guests turned toward them, curious. The manager looked embarrassed and tried to change the subject, but the businessman insisted. "Come on, let her play," he said with a grin. "We could use some entertainment tonight." The guests began to laugh, thinking it would be funny. The manager didn't like it, but couldn't argue with the man who was paying for the event. He turned to her and said quietly, "Fine, go ahead. Just don't make a scene." Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the piano. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Some guests smiled mockingly, others whispered to each other. She sat down slowly, her heart beating so fast that she thought everyone could hear it. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a brief moment, she thought about standing up and walking away. She imagined the laughter that would follow if she played badly. But then she remembered her father's face, the sound of his voice saying that music was something pure, something that came from the heart. She remembered all those nights at home when she played just for herself, not for praise. And she realized she didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to play. She took a deep breath and pressed the first key. The sound echoed softly through the room. The laughter faded a little. She played another note, then another. Her hands began to move naturally, remembering what they had always known. The melody grew smoother, fuller, richer. People stopped talking. Forks and glasses were set down. For the first time that night, the restaurant grew silent. The soft light from the chandelier reflected on her face as she played, her eyes half closed, her expression calm. The song she chose was one her father had taught her long ago, a song full of sadness and hope. The guests didn't know the story behind it, but they could feel it. The room was filled with something they couldn't explain. When she reached the last note, she lifted her hand slowly. The sound lingered for a moment before fading into silence. No one spoke. She didn't wait for applause. She just stood up quietly, nodded and returned to her duties as if nothing special had happened. But the silence that followed her steps was not ordinary. It was the silence of people who had witnessed something real, something they didn't expect from a person they had never noticed before. After that night, everything inside her felt a little different. She tried to act like nothing had happened, but something had awakened in her heart. The piano she touched in front of everyone had reminded her of who she used to be, who she still was deep inside. She hadn't felt that alive in years. Yet she also felt nervous every time she remembered the faces of those people staring at her. She didn't know if they had truly liked her playing or were just too shocked to say anything. The next morning, when she came to work, some of her co-workers were whispering and smiling at her. One of them said, "You really played last night?" "Everyone's talking about it." She blushed and nodded shyly. "I just played a little," she said softly, pretending it wasn't a big deal. but inside, she could still feel the rhythm of the music in her hands. Her manager didn't say much. He just gave her a long look and said, "Next time, wait for permission before you touch the piano again." His tone was cold, but there was something in his eyes, maybe confusion, maybe a bit of respect he didn't want to admit. She nodded quietly and went back to her work. That evening, when the same businessman came back for dinner, everyone felt tense. He was known for his temper and arrogance, but when he entered, he smiled as if nothing had happened. He sat at the same table, looked around the room, and then his eyes found her. "Ah," he said loudly, "the little pianist waitress." Everyone froze. Then he laughed and said, "You played better than I expected. You made my friends shut up for once. That's rare." Some of his guests chuckled, but this time it wasn't mocking. He gestured toward her and said, "Come here for a second." She hesitated, unsure what he wanted. When she approached the table, he said, "Tell me, where did you learn to play like that?" She looked down and answered softly, "My father taught me when I was a child." The businessman nodded, tapping his fingers on the table. "Interesting," he said. "You should play again sometime. Not tonight, though. Tonight I'm just here to eat." Then he waved his hand, dismissing her, but his voice had lost its arrogance. The other guests looked at her differently now. Some even smiled politely when she served their drinks. For the first time since she started working there, she felt seen as more than just a server. When the night ended, she walked home slowly, her thoughts full of mixed feelings. Part of her felt proud, but another part felt uncertain. She didn't know what that night would lead to, if anything at all. Maybe it was just one strange evening that people would forget. Still, when she reached home, she went straight to her piano. She sat there for a long time before playing a note. The keys were a little cold under her fingers, but soon they warmed as she played. She played the same song again, the one that had silenced the restaurant. This time she played it for herself, smiling softly. Her mother, who was resting in bed, listened from the next room. When the song ended, she called out, "You've been playing that old song again?" The young woman laughed gently and said, "It helps me feel calm." Her mother smiled faintly. "You've always had music in your heart," she said. "Don't ever lose it again." The next few days at work were calm. The restaurant ran smoothly and she kept to her routine. But the memory of that night stayed alive in the air. Some regular customers had heard about the incident from staff gossip. A few even asked her, "Are you the one who played for those guests?" She nodded shyly, and they said kind things like, "You must be very talented." She didn't know how to respond except with a polite thank you. One evening, a man came in alone. He wore a simple suit, nothing fancy. He ordered dinner and quietly watched her serve tables. When the place was almost empty, he approached her manager and spoke quietly for a few minutes. Then he left. The manager called her over after closing time. "That man works for a local music organization," he said. "He said he heard about your piano playing from someone at that dinner. He wants to see if you'd like to play at one of their charity events next week." She froze. "Play? Me?" she asked, almost whispering. The manager shrugged. "It's your choice. I told him I'd ask you. Don't make me look bad if you go." He walked away before she could answer. She stood there for a moment, her hands shaking. It felt like a dream. A real performance out in front of people, not just restaurant guests. She didn't even know if she still had the courage for something like that. But deep down she wanted to try. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering her father's words about how music should never be hidden. She got up quietly and sat at the piano again. Her fingers trembled at first, but then she began to practice. She practiced for hours, forgetting the time. She played until her hands hurt and her eyes were heavy with tears. It wasn't sadness. It was the feeling of coming back to something she loved and had lost for too long. The next day, she told her manager she would do it. He raised his eyebrows. "All right," he said. "Don't let them laugh at you." But she could tell he was secretly curious to see what would happen. A few evenings later, the man from the charity event returned with a friendly smile. He introduced himself as someone who organized small community concerts. "We just want to give local talent a chance to perform," he said. "You'll be fine. Just bring yourself and play what you love." She thanked him sincerely. It had been so long since anyone said something encouraging to her. At home, she practiced every night after work. Her mother sat nearby, listening quietly. Sometimes she gave small suggestions or hummed along, their tiny apartment filled with the sound of music, and even the neighbors would pause to listen. It became a small light in their ordinary lives. Finally, the day of the charity event arrived. It was held in a modest hall, not large but bright and warm. There were people of all ages, families, students, elderly couples. The atmosphere was friendly and calm, not like the fancy restaurant where people whispered behind glasses of wine. This was simple and honest. When her name was called, her heart pounded. She walked to the piano slowly, feeling her knees shake. The lights weren't too bright, but they were enough to make her squint a little. She sat down, took a deep breath, and touched the keys. Then she began to play. At first, her hands trembled slightly, but as the melody flowed, the fear melted away. The music took over. Every note carried a piece of her story, her struggles, her quiet nights, her dreams that refused to die. The audience listened in complete silence. She could feel their attention, their warmth. When she finished, there was a short pause before the applause started. It wasn't loud like thunder, but it was full of sincerity. People stood up, smiling, clapping longer than she expected. After the performance, several people came to speak with her. Some thanked her for the music. Others asked if she taught piano. She felt overwhelmed but grateful. She hadn't felt that kind of kindness in a long time. One woman said softly, "You play from the heart? That's rare." That night when she returned home, her mother was waiting awake. "How was it?" she asked eagerly. The young woman smiled, her eyes bright. "It was beautiful," she said. They listened. Her mother reached out and held her hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. From that day, small changes began to happen in her life. A few people from the audience reached out later, inviting her to perform at small gatherings or local events. They didn't pay much, but it wasn't about the money. It was about feeling alive again, about sharing something that came from her soul. Back at the restaurant, word began to spread even more. Some guests came asking for her by name, curious to see the waitress who could play like a professional. Even the manager softened a little. One day he said, "If you ever want to play here again, just let me know. It might bring in more customers." She smiled politely but didn't answer right away. She wanted to play, but she didn't want it to be a trick or a joke again. Still, something had shifted. She carried herself with quiet confidence now. She worked with the same care as before, but her eyes had a spark that wasn't there earlier. She didn't feel invisible anymore. One afternoon, as she was cleaning tables after the lunch shift, the same businessman walked in again. He wasn't laughing this time. He came alone and sat at the piano seat looking thoughtful. When she approached to greet him, he looked up and said, "You've been busy. I saw a clip of you online from that charity event. Someone filmed it." Her heart skipped. "You saw it?" she asked nervously. He nodded. "You were good. Really good." He paused, then added, "I was wrong to laugh at you that night." She didn't know what to say. He continued, "I know a few people who organize private concerts. Would you be interested if I introduce you?" She looked at him surprised. For a long second she couldn't speak. Finally she said softly, "I'd be honored." He nodded once and smiled faintly. "You deserve a better audience than a room full of drunk businessmen," he said, then stood up and left. When she told her mother later that evening, they both sat quietly for a while, processing the news. Then her mother said, "Maybe this is your time." The young woman smiled through tears and said, "Maybe it is." That night she sat at her piano again. The light in the room was dim, and the world outside was quiet. She began to play softly, letting the sound fill the small apartment. The melody rose and fell, telling her story better than words ever could. It was the sound of hope returning, slowly, gently, but unmistakably real. Days turned into weeks, and the young woman found herself in a world that felt slightly brighter than before. The offer from the businessman to introduce her to people who organized concerts stayed in her mind like a light she didn't want to lose sight of. She didn't know if anything would actually happen, but for the first time in years, she had something to look forward to. Every morning, when she took the bus to the restaurant, she would sit by the window and watch the people outside. The city looked different now. The same streets, the same buildings, but everything felt a little more alive, as if the world had started whispering again after a long silence. She thought about how quickly life could change, How one small moment could open a new path. One afternoon, as she was polishing glasses behind the counter, the restaurant phone rang. Her manager answered, nodded a few times, then looked toward her. "It's for you," he said. She froze. "For me?" she asked, confused. "Yes," he said. "Some concert person." He handed her the phone. Her hands shook as she held it. The voice on the other end was warm and professional. "Hello," the woman said. "I work with a music foundation that supports local artists. We saw a clip of your charity performance and we'd like to invite you to audition for our community showcase next month. It's a small event, but it's attended by people from the art and music world." For a moment, she didn't speak. She could barely believe what she was hearing. Finally, she said quietly, "I'd be happy to." The woman gave her the date and details before hanging up. When she put the phone down, she realized her heart was racing. The manager asked her what was that about. She told him, and he just nodded, pretending not to care, but she caught the small smile hiding behind his usual stern face. "Don't let it distract you from work," he said. She promised she wouldn't, but deep inside she was already dreaming again. That evening she rushed home to tell her mother. The moment she walked in, her mother could see the excitement on her face. "Something happened," she said, sitting up in bed. The young woman laughed and nodded. "They want me to audition for a showcase," she said breathlessly. Her mother's eyes filled with joy. "I told you your time will come," she said softly. From that day, the small apartment turned into a place of constant music. Every night after work, she practiced for hours. She chose pieces that showed emotion, not just skill. She wanted people to feel something when they listened, the same way she had felt when she first touched the piano as a child. Sometimes she made mistakes. Sometimes her fingers slipped and she would sigh in frustration. But her mother would smile and say, "Even your mistakes sound beautiful." Those words always made her heart feel lighter. As the audition day approached, she grew both nervous and excited. She didn't have fancy clothes or a professional look. All she had was her simple black dress that she had worn at the charity event. It wasn't new, but it was clean and neat. She told herself it didn't matter what she wore. It was her music that people would hear. The day finally arrived. The hall where the auditions were held was larger than she expected. There were a few people sitting quietly waiting for their turn, each holding sheet music or instruments. She felt small among them, like an outsider who didn't belong, but she reminded herself that she was here for a reason. She had earned this chance. When her turn came, she walked to the piano slowly, trying not to show how much her hands were shaking. She sat down, closed her eyes for a second, and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The first few notes were soft and careful, but as she continued, her confidence grew. The melody filled the room, and for those few minutes she forgot where she was. She forgot the people watching, the stage, the nervousness. Everything disappeared except the music. When the last note faded, she opened her eyes. The judges were silent for a moment before one of them smiled gently. "Thank you," he said. "That was lovely." She stood up, bowed politely, and left the stage. As she walked out of the hall, her knees felt weak. She didn't know what they thought or if she would be chosen, but she was proud that she had tried. A week later, while she was at work, she received a small envelope. Inside was a simple note: "Congratulations. You've been selected to perform at the community showcase." Her eyes filled with tears as she read it. She couldn't believe it was real. The night of the event came sooner than she expected. The showcase was held in a beautiful hall decorated with soft lights and flowers. It wasn't a grand concert, but to her it felt like stepping into a dream. There were musicians, singers, and artists of all kinds. She was the only one performing piano that night. Backstage, she waited nervously, listening to the sounds of other performers. Her heart was pounding. She looked down at her hands and whispered quietly, "Please don't fail me tonight." When her name was announced, she walked to the stage. The lights were bright and the audience was silent. She sat down and began to play the same song that had changed her life, the one she had played at the restaurant. This time, though, it felt different. She wasn't playing to prove anything. She was playing to share something from her soul. The melody rose and fell gently like waves. People in the audience leaned forward, drawn into her world. Some closed their eyes, listening deeply. She played with emotion that came from years of struggle, hope, and quiet strength. When she finished, there was a pause. That same kind of silence she had felt before in the restaurant. Then the applause came, steady and warm. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was filled with respect. After the performance, a few people came to talk to her. A kind-looking man with glasses introduced himself as someone who worked for a small recording studio. "You play beautifully," he said. "Would you ever consider recording something with us? Just a few tracks. We help new artists share their music online." Her breath caught. "I would love that," she said softly. That night, when she returned home, she told her mother everything. Her mother cried quietly, holding her hand. "See," she said through tears. "The world is finally hearing what I've always heard." Over the next few weeks, she visited the small studio. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like magic to her. The room smelled of coffee and old instruments. The people there were kind and encouraging. They helped her record a few simple piano pieces, songs she had written over the years but never shared with anyone. When the recordings were finished, the studio posted one online. They didn't expect much, but the video began to spread. People left comments like, "Her music feels like a story, and you can hear real emotion in every note." Within days, thousands of people had listened. At the restaurant, things began to change again. Guests started recognizing her from the video. Some came just to meet her. A few even asked if she could play live again. The manager finally gave in and said, "All right, you can play one song each evening." People seemed to like it. So, after her shift ended each night, she would sit at the piano in her uniform and play softly. The lights would dim and the restaurant would grow quiet. The sound of her music filled the air, gentle and pure. Even the clinking of glasses seemed to fade away. The same businessman who had once mocked her visited again. This time he sat quietly in a corner and listened. When she finished, he stood up and clapped. Afterward, he approached her and said, "You've come far. I'm glad I was there the first night. You taught me something about humility." She smiled and thanked him, not with pride but with peace. Her life wasn't suddenly perfect. She still worked long hours, still struggled to pay some bills. But she no longer felt invisible. People saw her now, not just as a waitress, but as a person with talent and heart. Every night when she walked home under the streetlights, she felt grateful. The city noise no longer bothered her. She had found her music again, and it gave meaning to everything. Her mother's health slowly improved, and together they planned small dreams, like buying a better piano one day or traveling to hear an orchestra perform live. She didn't know what the future held, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Sometimes, she would think about that first night when everything began, the night the businessman mocked her and asked her to play as a joke. If she had said no that night, if she had walked away, none of this would have happened. She realized that sometimes life opens a door disguised as humiliation or fear, and only by stepping through it can we find our real strength. As she lay in bed one evening, listening to the quiet hum of the city, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." Then she smiled and drifted off to sleep, the sound of the piano still echoing softly in her dreams. The room was completely still when her fingers began to slow down. Every sound in the world seemed to vanish. There was no laughter, no clinking of glasses, not even the quiet whisper of someone breathing. The last note hung in the air like a fragile thread, and when it faded, only silence remained. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made hearts beat louder inside people's chests. For a few seconds, no one moved. The guests who had come in to laugh, drink, and show off their money were now frozen in their seats. The light from the chandelier glimmered softly over their faces, revealing a mix of awe and disbelief. The waitress, who had been invisible all evening, had somehow filled the room with something greater than any of them could name. She sat there at the piano, her hands resting on the keys. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and she didn't look up right away. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't know what to expect. Would they laugh again? Would they think it was some lucky accident? She didn't even know how she had finished the piece. She just remembered losing herself somewhere in the middle, letting the music pull her along. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. It was slow and hesitant at first, almost cautious. But then another joined and another, until the sound of applause filled the entire room. The once silent crowd was now standing, cheering, some even whistling. The room that had mocked her minutes before now stood in her honor. She lifted her eyes and looked around, her face still calm but her heart trembling. She saw people she'd only ever known as customers now clapping for her, like she was someone important. A woman in a sparkling gown dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man at the back nodded slowly as if he had just remembered something long forgotten. Even Mr. Harrison, the one who had started the joke, was standing with his hands together, his face soft, his usual arrogance gone. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she rose from the piano bench, gave a small, awkward bow, and smiled faintly. The crowd cheered louder. She didn't know what to say or how to act. All she could do was smile, the kind of smile that comes from deep relief and quiet pride. As she stepped away, the restaurant manager hurried to her side, eyes wide in disbelief. He whispered quickly, "You didn't tell me you could play like that." She just smiled politely and said, "I just tried my best." He wanted to say more, but the guests were already calling her name, asking for another song. One of the older guests, a lady wearing pearls and kindness in her eyes, spoke gently, "Please, my dear, play again." That was beautiful. The words made her throat tighten. She had never been called my dear by anyone from this world before, but she shook her head softly and said, "Thank you, but I think one song is enough for tonight." The lady nodded with understanding. "Then we'll remember this one forever," she said and smiled. As the guests returned to their tables, there was still a strange quietness in the air. Not the cold silence from before, but something warmer. They spoke softly, as if afraid to break the spell that still lingered from her music. She went back to the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. Her coworkers stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. One of the waiters whispered, "That was you out there?" She nodded shyly, still trying to catch her breath. Another laughed in amazement. "You made them all shut up. I've never seen that room so quiet." She laughed a little too, mostly out of disbelief. "I didn't even plan to play, I just did it." When her shift ended, she stepped out into the cold night air. The city lights blinked like stars around her, and she pulled her coat tighter. The streets were empty, and her shoes clicked against the pavement. She felt light, almost unreal, like she was walking through a dream that hadn't quite ended. She kept thinking about the look on their faces, the way they had changed from mocking smiles to pure silence. She thought of her mother and how she used to sit on the old sofa listening to her play. Her mother always said that music could reach places that words never could. Maybe she had been right. The next morning she woke up early expecting everything to feel normal again. But it didn't. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from coworkers who couldn't stop talking about the night before. Someone had even posted a short video of her playing. She opened it, her heart racing, and saw herself sitting at the piano, eyes closed, her hands moving like they belonged there. The caption said, "The waitress who silenced the rich with her music." At first she felt embarrassed. She didn't like attention, but then she started reading the comments. People were writing things like, "This gave me chills," and "She plays with her soul." Some even asked who she was and where they could hear more of her music. She didn't know how to feel. It was strange to see herself become a story overnight. By noon, more people had shared the video. It had thousands of views. She turned off her phone for a while because it all felt too much. At work that evening, the restaurant felt different. People looked at her differently. Some of the regular guests smiled at her kindly, while others whispered behind menus, pointing. The manager called her into his office before her shift began. He looked at her seriously, but there was a soft pride in his eyes. "You did something last night I'll never forget," he said. "We've had famous singers and musicians here before, but no one ever moved people like that." "You should be proud," she nodded quietly. "Thank you, sir," she said. He leaned back. "I've been getting calls all day. People want to know who you are. One guest even asked if you'd play again at another event." Her eyes widened. "Me? Play again?" He smiled. "Yes, you, but I told them you might need time to think about it." She didn't know what to say. The thought of performing again scared her, but it also filled her with a strange kind of joy. That night, as she served tables, people kept thanking her. One man said his wife hadn't stopped talking about her piano performance since last night. Another said he felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years. She listened, smiled politely, and kept working. Later in the evening, Mr. Harrison came in again. The one who had started it all. The one who had laughed first. She saw him before he saw her and felt her heart sink a little. But when he finally noticed her, his face was not arrogant or cold. He looked almost humble. He walked up to her quietly and said, "I owe you an apology." She looked surprised. "You don't have to, sir." "No," he said, shaking his head, "I do. I was rude and I made a joke at your expense. I thought I was being clever. But what you did out there, it made me realize how small that kind of behavior is." She didn't know how to respond. He sighed, then said softly, "Your music reminded me of my late wife. She used to play the piano, too. I haven't listened to music like that since she passed. So thank you." Her eyes softened. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. He nodded. "You gave me something back I didn't know I'd lost." Then he handed her an envelope. "For you," he said. "Not as payment. Just a gesture." She opened it later that night after he'd left. Inside was a short handwritten note and a small amount of money. But the words mattered more than the money. The note said, "Never stop playing. The world needs to hear you." She held the note against her chest for a long time, feeling something deep inside her shift. It wasn't pride or joy, but something gentler, like healing. The next few days passed quietly, but people kept coming to the restaurant asking about the waitress who played the piano. The manager decided to let her play a short piece every Friday evening. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she could face that kind of attention again. But when she sat at the piano once more, something inside her felt at home. Every time she played, the same silence filled the room. Not the silence of disbelief anymore, but of connection. People listened, really listened, and left with a kind of peace in their eyes. She never thought that something so small, one song, one moment, could change her life. But it did. It reminded her that even when the world looks down on you, there's still a place where your heart can speak louder than their laughter. Late at night, when she went home after work, she would still sit at her old piano and play softly, smiling to herself. The sound of those keys had always been her escape, but now it felt like her voice. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had faced a room full of people who didn't believe in her, and she had silenced them with nothing but truth and emotion. And even though the applause had faded and the lights had dimmed, the echo of that night stayed with her, in her heart, in the memory of every note, and in the quiet understanding that music had given her something she never thought she'd find again. Respect, hope, and a chance to dream. She didn't need fame or riches. All she needed was that piano, her hands, and the courage to keep playing. And from that night on, she did. The morning sun peeked through the thin curtains and painted soft lines across the small room. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the quiet street below. It had been a week since that night, yet her mind kept replaying the same moment. The way the crowd had fallen silent, the way her heart had raced, and how she had felt truly alive for the first time in years. But she still didn't know what to make of it all. Her phone buzzed again. She had been getting messages every day, some from coworkers, others from strangers who had seen the video online. At first, it made her nervous. She wasn't used to being noticed. She had spent most of her life trying to stay invisible, moving quietly through the world. But now her face and music had been seen by thousands of people she didn't even know. When she finally opened one of the messages, it was from a woman who said, "Your music helped me through a hard night. Thank you for reminding me there is still beauty in the world." Another said, "Please keep playing. You have a gift." The messages were kind and warm, and even though she didn't know these people, something inside her softened each time she read their words. At work, the restaurant felt different. The manager smiled more than usual. The guests who used to ignore her now greeted her by name. Some asked if she would play again. Every Friday evening, she played one song before her shift began, and every time she finished, the same silence filled the room. It was never the silence of judgment anymore. It was peace. One evening, after she played her weekly piece, a man approached her table. He was tall, with gray hair and kind eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Lewis, a music producer who had been at the restaurant the night of her first performance. He said softly, "You might not remember me, but I remember your music. It stayed with me." She nodded politely, unsure where the conversation was going. "I work with young musicians," he continued. "Some of them have talent, but few have the kind of emotion you play with. I'd like to help you record a song if you're willing." "No pressure, no cost. I just think the world should hear you properly." Her first instinct was to refuse. She wasn't ready for that kind of attention. She didn't even think she was good enough. But Mr. Lewis seemed patient. He didn't push. He handed her his card and said, "Think about it. Call me if you ever feel ready." Then he smiled and walked away. For days she kept the card tucked in her apron pocket. Sometimes she looked at it during her lunch break, reading the name and number over and over. Something about it scared her. Recording meant stepping into a bigger world, a world full of expectations, judgment, and pressure. But another part of her whispered that this was her chance, the one she thought she'd lost long ago. That night she sat at her old piano again, the same one she had played since she was a child. The wood was scratched, the keys slightly uneven, but it was her friend, her only constant. She placed the card on the piano stand and began to play softly. The notes floated gently through the room. Her mother, sitting in her chair near the window, smiled. "You played beautifully tonight," her mother said, her voice weak but full of warmth. "Thank you," she replied. Her mother looked at the card resting near the keys. "Someone believes in you. Maybe you should too." She looked at her mother's tired face, the lines that years of worry had carved, and nodded quietly. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, she picked up her phone and called the number. A week later, she stood inside a small recording studio for the first time in her life. The walls were covered with soft panels, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and new wood. Mr. Lewis greeted her with the same gentle kindness. He introduced her to a few musicians who would help with the recording. They were friendly, though she could feel their curiosity. None of them expected the quiet waitress to create something extraordinary. When she sat at the piano, she felt nervous. Her hands trembled just like that night in the restaurant. But once she began to play, everything else disappeared. The music filled the room, soft and full of feeling. She played from her heart, not thinking about perfection or mistakes. When she finished, the room was silent again, just like before. Mr. Lewis stood behind the glass, smiling. That, he said, was real. They recorded a few more songs over the next week. Each one was simple, emotional, and honest. He helped her upload them online under the title "The Waitress Who Played for Silence." At first, only a few people listened. But then the numbers began to grow. Comments poured in from people all over the world. People who said her music made them cry, made them think, made them feel something again. Her life started to change quietly. She still worked at the restaurant, still cleaned tables and carried plates, but now people came just to see her. Some even traveled from other cities to hear her play. The manager once joked, "You're the reason we're fully booked every Friday." She laughed softly but didn't let it get to her head. She still saw herself as the same person, just someone who loved to play. One evening, while finishing her shift, a reporter approached her. He wanted to do a story about her, about how a waitress had moved the hearts of the rich with nothing but music. She hesitated but agreed, hoping that maybe her story could inspire someone else who had given up on their dream. When the article came out, it spread quickly. People were touched by her humility and her journey. They admired how she never chased fame but found it naturally through sincerity. A few days later, she received an invitation to perform at a charity event. The letter said they wanted her to play a piece that would remind people of kindness, of hope, and of second chances. She was nervous again, but her mother smiled and said, "Play the way you always do. Let them feel your heart." The night of the charity event, she stood backstage in a long, simple dress. The hall was large and filled with people from all walks of life: businessmen, artists, families, and children. She could hear the gentle hum of the crowd before her name was announced. When she walked onto the stage, the lights were bright, almost blinding. She could barely see the faces in front of her, but she could feel their energy. She took a deep breath and sat at the piano. The first few seconds were quiet. Then she began to play. The melody was slow and soft, like a whisper. It spoke of struggle, of pain, but also of courage and love. It was her story, told not with words but through sound. Every note carried a piece of her past. The long nights of working late, the tears she hid, the dreams she thought had vanished. As she played, something shifted in the room. People stopped moving. Some closed their eyes. Others held their breath. The same silence returned, the same silence that had once filled the restaurant. When the last note faded, there was stillness. Then came the applause, thunderous and full of emotion. People stood clapping, cheering, some even crying. She looked out into the crowd and saw her mother sitting in the front row, clapping with tears streaming down her face. The sight made her heart swell. She had never seen her mother look so proud. After the performance, several people approached her. One man said he wanted to sponsor her next show. Another said her music had given him hope again after losing his job. A woman said her child had been inspired to start learning piano. Each story touched her deeply. She realized that music wasn't just something she loved. It was something that connected her to others. That night, when she returned home, her mother hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought your dream back to life." She smiled softly. "I just played from my heart," she said. But deep down she knew it was more than that. It was the years of pain, the long hours of work, the small moments of kindness that had shaped her into who she was. The next morning, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an international music academy. They had seen her video and wanted to offer her a scholarship to study music again. She couldn't believe it. Her hands trembled as she read the message over and over. Her mother cried with joy when she told her. "This is your second chance," she said. "Take it." For the next few days, she thought about it carefully. It would mean leaving her job, leaving the familiar life she had built. But it would also mean finally doing what she loved fully, without limits. When she walked into the restaurant to tell her manager about her decision, he smiled sadly but proudly. "We'll miss you," he said. "But you belong on that stage, not behind a tray." Her co-workers clapped for her that night, cheering her on as she played her final song at the restaurant. It was a soft, emotional melody that carried a quiet goodbye. The guests listened, some wiping away tears. When she finished, they gave her the warmest applause she had ever received. As she stepped out of the restaurant that night, the city lights shimmered above her like stars. The cold air brushed against her face, but she didn't mind. She looked up and smiled. The road ahead was uncertain, but her heart was light. She had been the invisible waitress once, the one no one noticed. But now her music had found its place in the world. And maybe, just maybe, her story would help others find theirs too. The morning she left for the academy was bright and calm. The air carried the soft chill of early spring, and the streets were washed clean from a night of gentle rain. She stood by the window watching the sun rise over the rooftops, feeling both nervous and excited. Her small suitcase stood by the door, neatly packed with clothes, music sheets, and the small photograph of her mother that she always kept near her piano. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, smiling softly. "You've come a long way," she said. She nodded. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her mother reached out and took her hand. "You always had this in you. You just needed the right moment to show the world." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands. Then she stood up, took one last look around the tiny apartment that had held so many memories, and whispered, "I'll make you proud." Her mother smiled, her eyes glistening. "You already have." The taxi arrived, and soon she was on her way to the station. The city she had known for so long passed by outside the window. The small cafe where she used to sit after work, the park bench where she sometimes read, and the glowing sign of the restaurant where everything had changed. As the car drove past it, she felt a small smile form on her lips. The memory of that night, the laughter, the silence, the applause, still lived inside her like a quiet flame. When she reached the academy, she could hardly believe her eyes. The building was large and beautiful, with tall glass windows and gardens filled with flowers. Students moved through the courtyard carrying instruments, sheet music, and coffee cups. The sound of pianos and violins filled the air. For a moment she just stood there, unsure if she belonged. But then someone greeted her with a friendly smile and showed her around. She was given a small dorm room with a piano inside. The moment she saw it, her hands itched to touch the keys. That night, after unpacking, she sat down and played softly. The notes echoed in the quiet room, wrapping around her like comfort. The next day, her classes began. She felt both excited and afraid. Many of the students had been studying music for years. They spoke in technical terms she didn't always understand, and their fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision. At first, she felt small, like a beginner again. But when she played, something different happened. Her sound wasn't perfect, but it was real. Her teachers noticed it. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, told her, "You play from the heart. That is something no lesson can teach." Weeks passed and she found her rhythm. She practiced for hours every day, sometimes forgetting to eat. Her fingers grew stronger, her confidence deeper. Whenever she felt tired, she thought of her mother and the journey that had brought her here. from serving tables to standing on a stage, from hiding her dreams to living them again. Sometimes, she walked through the academy gardens in the evening, when the sun turned the sky orange. She would close her eyes and listen to the sound of students practicing in distant rooms. It made her feel alive. One afternoon, her teacher told her about an upcoming performance where the best students would be chosen to play in front of an audience of musicians, critics, and sponsors. "It's a chance to be seen," he said. "You should try." The thought of performing in front of such people made her nervous. But deep down, she knew she had to do it. She had played for people who doubted her before, and she had silenced them with truth. Maybe she could do it again. She spent weeks preparing. Every morning she woke early, practiced scales, and worked on her piece. It was an original composition, a melody she had written in her tiny apartment long ago. It told her story, from the quiet pain of struggle to the joy of rediscovery. The night of the performance came faster than she expected. The hall was large and filled with people dressed in elegant clothes. The lights shone bright and the air buzzed with quiet tension. She sat backstage, her hands clasped tightly, her heart beating fast. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the piano. The applause sounded distant, like waves far away. She sat down, took a deep breath, and let her fingers rest on the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes and imagined her mother sitting in the front row, smiling like she always did. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft and trembling, like a whisper in the dark. But as she continued, the music grew stronger, flowing like a river that had been waiting to burst free. The melody carried all her memories, the long nights at the restaurant, the laughter of the crowd, the silence that had followed, the tears in her mother's eyes, and the quiet hope that had never truly left her. The audience was still. No one moved. Her music wrapped around them like a story without words. It spoke of struggle, of kindness, of the beauty that can grow from pain. When the final note faded, there was silence once more, the same kind of silence that had changed her life that first night. Then came the applause, long and full of warmth. People stood clapping, cheering, their faces glowing with admiration. She bowed her head, tears shining in her eyes. After the show, several people approached her. Some wanted to meet her, others just wanted to thank her for the music. One of them was a well-known composer who told her, "You remind me of why I fell in love with music." Another offered her a chance to record an album of her own compositions. She could hardly believe it. The world that had once looked so distant was now opening its doors to her. That night, when she returned to her dorm room, she sat by the window with her phone in her hand. She called her mother, and when her mother answered, her voice was full of emotion. "I watched the video," her mother said softly. "You played beautifully." "I was thinking of you," she whispered. Her mother's voice trembled. "I knew you would find your way. You never gave up." After hanging up, she sat quietly for a long time, thinking about everything that had led her here. Every struggle, every doubt, every moment when she thought it was all over. And she realized something. The road had never really been about fame or recognition. It was about finding her voice, her strength, and the courage to keep playing even when no one was listening. Months later, she released her first album. It wasn't flashy or filled with grand arrangements. It was simple, honest, and full of heart. The songs told stories of everyday people, of love, loss, and hope. The same kind of stories that had shaped her own life. The album quickly found an audience. People wrote letters saying how her music had comforted them during hard times. Some said it gave them courage to start over. She began performing around the country, each concert filled with warmth and gratitude. But no matter how big the stage became, she never forgot where it all started. Behind a piano in a restaurant, surrounded by laughter and disbelief. One evening, after a concert in a beautiful old theater, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The crowd was still cheering inside, but she stood quietly under the streetlight, breathing in the peace of the moment. A young girl approached her shyly, holding a small notebook. "Can I have your autograph?" the girl asked. She smiled and signed the notebook. Then the girl looked up and said softly, "I want to play the piano like you someday." She bent down a little and said, "Then you will. Just keep playing, even when no one believes in you." The girl nodded seriously, and her mother thanked her before they walked away. She watched them go, her heart warm. Years later, her name became known not for fame but for feeling. She played in concert halls, at charity events, and sometimes in small cafes just because she liked the sound of music filling quiet spaces. She started a program to teach music to children who couldn't afford lessons. She told them all the same thing. Music doesn't care who you are or where you come from. If you love it, it will love you back. Her mother grew older, but her eyes never lost their light. She often sat in the front row whenever her daughter performed nearby, clapping softly, proud beyond words. And sometimes, when she played, she would still think of that one night. The night when the world laughed until it fell silent. The night when she realized that one small moment of courage could change everything. She never tried to be famous. She never chased perfection. She just played with honesty, and that honesty became her gift to the world. One quiet evening, long after her last concert of the season, she returned to her old neighborhood. The restaurant was still there, though it had changed a little. The new manager recognized her immediately and invited her in. She smiled and asked if she could play just once for old times' sake. The staff gathered around and she sat at the same piano she had played years ago. Her fingers touched the keys and the first notes drifted into the air. It was the same melody, soft, emotional, full of memory. When she finished, there was silence again, gentle and pure, and in that silence she smiled. Because it was there, in that room, that she had found her voice.